Taking you live now to our nation's capital. On your screen is the Chief Public Health Officer, Theresa Tam. This is government officials and also health experts giving us an update on the response in Canada to COVID-19. We will listen in live right here on CBC News Network.
Labs across Canada have tested over 2,415,000 people for COVID-19 to date. Over the past week, an average of 38,000 people were tested daily, with 1% testing positive. These numbers change quickly, and you can get the updates in the evenings on canada.ca/coronavirus. For weeks, we've been looking at our collective progress to slow epidemic growth and get COVID-19 under control. We've still got a few hot spots in Canada, and we've seen more than one new flare-up to remind us that COVID-19 has not gone away. The marathon continues. I wish I could say we were close to the finish line or even halfway, but that simply isn't the case, and no one can say for sure how far off we are. We've got a very clear motivation to keep going, and there is absolute certainty that giving up is not an option. We've got to work together to get through this. All along the way, we've had countries ahead of and beside us in this marathon, or are doing similar things but with different degrees of success. Contrasts, both within Canada as well as globally, are teaching us many things about COVID-19 epidemic control. Globally, there are now over 9 million cases, with an average of almost 150,000 new cases being reported every day over the past 7 days. And if we think those cases aren't close to home, think again. Almost 60% of these new cases are being reported from the Americas. Summer hasn't made COVID-19 go away. Populations around the world are still highly susceptible, and epidemics can be reignited anywhere at any time. That doesn't mean we don't control our own future here in Canada. On the contrary, with COVID-19 around us, we can't have a reopening that doesn't include all of us working together to keep our guard up and keep the curve down. This is the long game. The first rule is to be aware of the risks of exposure and to make informed decisions, taking necessary precautions to keep you and your loved ones safe. Those precautions include keeping the 2 meters of physical distancing, washing hands often, covering coughs and sneezes, layering with a non-medical mask or face covering, and staying home when sick. And now that spaces are reopening, we need to avoid or strictly limit our time in settings and situations that increase our risk of exposure to the virus, like closed spaces with poor ventilation, crowded places with large numbers of people gathered, and close contacts where you can't keep the 2 meters apart from others. Thank you. Merci.
Merci beaucoup, Dr. Tam.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tam. Dr. New? Thank you. Good afternoon. I'd like to make a few observations today on what we're learning about the long game in the control of COVID-19. But first, here are the latest numbers for COVID-19 in Canada. There have been 101,337 cases, including 8,430 deaths. 63% of the cases have now recovered. Labs across Canada have tested over 2,415,000 people for COVID-19 to date. Over the past week, an average of 38,000 people were tested daily, with 1% testing positive. These numbers change quickly and are updated daily in the evenings on canada.ca/coronavirus. For weeks, we've been looking at our collective progress to slow epidemic growth and get COVID-19 under control. We've still got a few hotspots in Canada, and we've seen more than one new flare-up to remind us that COVID-19 has not gone away. The marathon continues. I wish we could say that we were close to the finish line or even halfway, but that simply isn't the case. And no one can say for sure how far off we are. We've got a very clear motivation to keep going, and there is absolute certainty that giving up is not an option. We've got to work together to get through this. All along the way, We've had countries ahead of us and beside us in this marathon. All are doing similar things, but with different degrees of success. Contrasts, both within Canada as well as globally, are teaching us many things about COVID-19 epidemic control. Globally, there are now over 9 million cases, with an average of almost 150,000 new cases being reported every day over the past 7 days. And if we think these cases aren't close to home, think again. Almost 60% of the new cases are being reported from the Americas. Sabre hasn't made COVID-19 go away. Populations around the world are still highly susceptible, and epidemics can be reignited anywhere at any time. That doesn't mean we don't control our own future here in Canada. On the contrary. With COVID-19 around us, we can't have a reopening that doesn't include all of us working together to keep our guard up and keep the curve down. This is the long game. The first rule is to be aware of risks of exposure and to make informed decisions, taking necessary precautions to keep you and your loved ones safe. Those precautions include our Team Canada public health rules, keeping 2 meters of physical distancing, washing hands often, covering your nose and your mouth when coughing or sneezing, wearing a non-medical mask or face covering, and staying home when sick. Now that spaces are reopening, public spaces are reopening, we need to avoid or strictly limit our time in settings and situations that increase our risk of exposure to virus, like closed spaces with poor ventilation, crowded places with large number of people gathered, and close contact where you can't keep 2 meters apart from others. Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. New. I would like to now give the floor to Minister Anita Anand.
Anita.
Thank you so much, Jean-Yves. Bonjour tout le monde. Hello.
Hello, everyone.
It has been more than 100 days since the COVID-19 pandemic struck Canada and changed daily life in this country as we know it. Since the beginning, our government has been vigilant in ramping up procurement and distribution of vital equipment needed to fight the virus, supplementing the procurements of provinces and territories.
Today, we find ourselves in a different situation. Canadians are doing their part to flatten the curve, and we are laying the foundation for an economic recovery. With the virus still ravaging in many parts of the world, our progress to date could not have been possible without a truly committed nationwide effort.
Although the number of COVID-19 cases continues to decline across the country, we cannot be sure that the danger has passed, as Dr. New just suggested. We must be prepared for a potential second wave of the virus. And that is why my department continues to adhere to a two-pronged contractual approach of buying aggressively in highly competitive global markets, while at the same time diversifying our supply chains, including in terms of domestic production. Now for an update on international shipments. This week, an additional 9 cargo planes chartered by Canada brought home much-needed supplies, such as gloves, gowns, and masks. This brings our total to 78 plane loads of supplies received to date. We also welcomed our 13th shipment of hand sanitizer at the Port of Vancouver, and we continue to receive about 500,000 N95 respirator masks from 3M in the United States on a monthly basis. This is in addition to the larger order that 3M is delivering directly to provincial and territorial health care systems. Les entreprises canadiennes maintenant
Canadian businesses now. Coupled with our international shipments, Canadian companies continue to deliver, helping Canada's pandemic response while sustaining and creating jobs across the country. Companies led by traditionally underrepresented groups are very much a part of our response to COVID-19, stepping up to supply the country with goods.
The Spirit Healthcare Group of Indigenous-led companies in Manitoba is an excellent illustration. In early March, Spirit Healthcare sourced and then delivered essential PPE for Manitoba's First Nations. The group's pharmacy and medical supply company, Spirit RX, then ramped up delivery of PPE to meet both provincial and territorial and federal requests. Spirit RX provided 1 million isolation gowns for the province of Manitoba and provided the federal government with more than 656 digital thermometers. We must and will continue to engage with Indigenous-led businesses. This objective is precisely the intention behind our recent request for proposals aimed at specifically Indigenous businesses for the provision of 25 million non-medical masks. That request for a proposal closes today. The response has been encouraging, and we will have more to say on new contracts in the coming weeks. Maintenant, les livraisons. Les fournisseurs livrent la marchandise.
Now deliveries. Suppliers are delivering on all fronts, and Canadian companies are playing an imperative role in our efforts to secure the most vital personal protective equipment. We have now received more than 205 million units of various personal protective equipment. That includes millions of gowns, face shields, gloves, surgical masks, and N95 respirators, with many of those being produced right here at home by Canadian manufacturers.
And now for our weekly PPE update. Gowns. To date, we have received a total of 4.9 million gowns, with about half of them made in Canada. Face shields. We have also received a total of nearly 18 million face shields, and the vast majority of these are made right here at home. Hand sanitizer. We now have more than 7 million liters of hand sanitizer, and most of it was made right here in Canada as well. Masks and N95 respirators. We also have nearly 111 million surgical masks delivered, with more on the way, and we continue to receive shipments of much sought-after N95 respirators. In the coming weeks, these deliveries will include Canadian-made N95s as part of our 10-year agreement with Medicom to manufacture and deliver on a monthly basis. We will be prepared for any eventuality. To date, our government has distributed some 3.5 million N95s and equivalent masks across the country. This week, I'm also pleased to report that after receiving Health Canada certification, CAE is set to start shipping Made in Canada ventilators every week to the Government of Canada. That company, based in Montreal and primarily focused on civil aviation and defense, was able to retool, recalling its employees from temporary layoff after being awarded a contract for the production of ventilators. Now it joins other Canadian manufacturers, such as Thornhill Medical, that are providing us with these life-saving Canadian-made machines. Now for an announcement. From the significant deliveries of PPE that Canada has received, it is clear that we have succeeded in securing contracts with a wide range of suppliers. As we move into the next phase of our response to the crisis, we are returning to the use of competitive processes where circumstances permit, the longer timelines required to conduct a competition. I'm happy to announce that this week, After publicly soliciting proposals from Canadian suppliers, we have signed 4 contracts for cloth face masks. One of these contracts includes an agreement with Westport Manufacturing, which will be making these masks in its plants in Vancouver and Mississauga. Westport is another example of Canadian companies meeting the challenge of our time. After nearly 75 years of producing custom drapes and beddings, the company is pivoting its business to align with the demand for PPE at present in this country. In so doing, it is not only providing Canada with domestically manufactured masks, but also maintaining jobs in 2 Canadian cities. In closing, Canadians should know that as we move forward into the next phases of the pandemic and face a potential second wave, the Government of Canada is prepared. We are working with other levels of government and our industry partners to ensure that frontline workers have access to PPE needed to fight the pandemic. Global demand for PPE and medical supplies will continue to go up, and as it does, Canada will continue to keep up. Thank you so much. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you.
Merci, Anita.
Thank you, Anita. I'll ask Navdeep to speak now.
Thank you very much, Jean-Yves. And as we've been doing on a weekly basis, I'd like to share an update on our efforts to put into place a secure domestic supply of key personal protective equipment for our frontline healthcare workers. We're bringing together Canadian ingenuity and expertise to come up with homegrown solutions to the challenges that we are facing today. To date, over 6,400 Canadian firms have offered their expertise and capacity to retooling, scaling up, providing urgently needed goods and services. And I cannot say enough of how proud I am of our incredible Canadian innovative businesses and the work that they're doing during this challenging time. A few weeks ago, we put out a call under the Innovative Solutions Canada program, and this time through the prototype stream, where departments right across government can test existing prototypes for both medical and non-medical solutions. And we've asked for creative made-in-Canada technologies to address the COVID-19 pandemic and similar public health emergencies. And the response has been absolutely outstanding. En seulement 2 semaines, nous avons reçu plus de 550.
In just 2 weeks, we received over 550 proposals from innovators across the country.
Is Lind Equipment, based in Markham, Ontario, to which we have now awarded a contract under the Innovative Solutions Canada prototype testing stream. They're developing a UV sanitizer innovation called Apollo Light, using lead-generated UVC light capable of decontaminating work areas and surfaces, and could potentially enable us to reuse personal protective equipment. There is promising science that indicates that UVC light can inactivate bacteria and viruses, including coronaviruses like SARS. And to move the project forward, we will be piloting the Apollo Light in certain office and workspaces in Global Affairs Canada's head office in Ottawa. Nous allons mettre à l'essai l'Apollo Light dans 2 lieux de travail.
We will be piloting Apollo Light in 2 workplaces, Global Affairs Canada headquarters in Ottawa.
Workplace as well as vehicles such as trains, buses, police, ambulance, and fire trucks. The next generation manufacturing supercluster has also selected several projects to support the fight against COVID-19. Le premier projet est celui de Hexacad de Boisbriand au Québec.
The first one is Hexacad from Boisbriand, Quebec, which will build molds that will be used to produce the plastic consumables for testing.
Next is a project led by Cloud Diagnostics based in Kitchener. They make wrist cuffs that can remotely monitor a patient's pulse and other symptoms. And this technology can free up much needed hospital beds by sending non-urgent patients home while still being able to monitor how they're doing on a daily basis. Last is Myant. It's out of Etobicoke, and it's producing a new textile-based monitoring system for patients and frontline healthcare workers. Their smart garment technology has the ability to read and collect biometrics from the user's body via sensors, which are then analyzed by Mayant's AI platform to essentially identify signs of health issues. And these initiatives add to the overall 37 COVID-19 response projects announced to date by our digital technology, next generation technology, and scale AI superclusters. I'd just like to close today by saying to everyone that has been contributing to our efforts over the past few months, and I'm talking about our researchers, our entrepreneurs, our businesses, both large and small, we are sincerely grateful for your efforts. And today's announcements are further proof of your commitment to Canadians. And I know we share the goals of protecting Canadians now as we look to gradually reopening up the economy. So it's so heartening to see so many Canadians pulling together to achieve these goals. Once again, thank you very much. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you so much, Navdeep, and we would all be happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, Minister. So as usual, we're going to start with 3 questions on the phone before we turn to the room. 1 question, 1 follow-up. Operator, over to you.
Thank you. Merci. Our first question, notre première question, nous vient Micheline Laflamme avec Radio-Canada. Please go ahead. À vous la parole.
Question from Radio-Canada. Question. Mr. Duclos, I'd like to talk about the letter that lawyer Brian Greenspan wrote to the Minister of Justice concerning the imprisonment of the 2 Michaels in China. You have Louise Arbour and Alan Rock, 2 lawyers, one a former cabinet minister, saying that the government does not need to carry out extradition measures. It could already decide not to extradite, and that this could lead to the freeing of the 2 Michaels. Dans l'avenir, est-ce que vous pouvez en discuter?
Merci pour la question et j'espère que vous m'entendez.
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me. I think there are technical problems. There are 2 very important things. We are very worried. The service will be interrupted briefly.
Que ces 2 Michael vivent depuis trop longtemps maintenant en Chine pour toutes sortes de raisons. La situation extraordinairement injuste qu'ils vivent de par exemple, leur incapacité d'avoir des services consulaires, ce qui est totalement contre
their inability to have consular services, which is completely against international agreements. We're angry. We're worried about this situation. We think it's unfair the way China has been treating these prisoners. In Canada, we function on the basis of integrity and upholding the justice system. That is why yesterday Mr. Trudeau reminded us that we will continue to work based on the independence of the judiciary system in Canada. That is not only the strength of our country and our institutions, but this allows us to maintain Canada's reputation beyond our borders.
Micheline, juste un petit instant. Monsieur Duclos, si vous pouviez répéter en anglais.
Mr. Duclos, could you please repeat your answer in English?
Things in this very unfortunate situation. The first thing is that we are very preoccupied and saddened and angered by the current situation which is affecting the 2 Michaels. We find it very unfortunate, unfair and counterproductive for China to treat the 2 Michaels in that particular manner. There are all sorts of things that we don't understand, including the fact that they don't have access to consular services, which is an absolute obligation under international treaties. So we are making that well understood and well felt by the Chinese government. At the same time, we in Canada are used to and proud of the independence and the integrity and the respect for our judicial system, and will continue to do that, because not only is it important for Canadians and Canadian institutions to function and to prosper, but it's also important for the reputation of Canada outside of its frontiers, and it's particular for the ability of Canada to draw the support that it has drawn from in the last few days in telling China that Canadians, Canada, and many other countries across the world find this situation totally unacceptable.
Merci, Monsieur le Ministre. Micheline, en suivi?
Follow-up question. According to Mr. Greenspan, Ms. Louise Arbour, former judge of the Canadian Supreme Court, I don't need to describe her to you, they say that the minister has the authority. Would this not be the time to have a debate on how far we can go? Answer, we're in a free society.
C'est non seulement possible, mais c'est souhaitable aussi que des gens expriment leurs opinions sur la situation. Le Premier ministre Trudeau, toutefois, a été clair hier que nous allons suivre les modes appropriés de travailler au Canada sur la base à nouveau de l'intégrité, du respect et de la réputation du système judiciaire à la fois
Justice system, not only in our own country, but as we are seen abroad.
Thank you. Merci. Our next question. Notre prochaine question nous vient de Jordan Press with the Canadian Press. Please go ahead. À vous la parole.
Good afternoon. My first question is for Minister Anand. Can you just explain, in moving back to this competitive bid process, where is going to be the line between what supplies are going to be subject to that bid process, or that competitive process, and which supplies are not going to be part of that because they're deemed more essential than others?
Anita, we don't hear you. You might want to turn your microphone.
Yes, it's on. Thank you so much for the question. There is not one single firm line between the decision to move to competitive bid processes versus sole sourcing. The decision regarding sole sourcing has been made under our emergency authorities, given the crisis that we are in and the urgent need to source PPE and other items. And that urgency, in light of global demand and the fragility of international supply chains, continues to exist. Where possible, we are moving to competitive bid processes as a means to supplement our current supply chains. And as I have said repeatedly, our strategy is to have multiple supply chains operating in tandem so that we are able to procure PPE from diverse sources. And so the competitive bid process is a supplement to our current procurements. And as we have more stability in global supply chains for masks, gowns, gloves, and the like, we will be moving to competitive processes.
Jordan, follow up.
Thank you for that. As a follow-up, actually, I'd like to ask Dr. Tam a question. I'm sorry to throw a change up here to you, Doctor, but I'd like to ask about the Toronto Blue Jays. They are supposed to start training as soon as, I believe it's July 1st, under the Major League Baseball's proposal that was unveiled yesterday. I'm just curious, given some of the proposals that we've had with the NHL, can you just talk about whether the Blue Jays would actually be able to train in Toronto without the 14-day quarantine period? And if so, do you foresee any way for actually Major League Baseball games to be played in Toronto this year, considering the visiting teams would all be coming from the United States?
So I think we've had discussions with essentially all the key professional international leagues, and including Major League Baseball. And I think it's predicated, of course, on an actual mitigation plan that ensures the safety of Canadians and, of course, for the league itself, the safety of its players. So I think similarly with the NHL, those plans have to be essentially supported by local and provincial public health authorities. When players come into, let's say, it's a bit like coming back to work in Toronto, where you come back to training, they are subjected to 14 days of quarantine. As the way that I understand it anyways, so individual training, etc. in Toronto, if you're first coming in. But as the teams coalesce and come together, there are the concepts of cohorting or group quarantine, whereby the players have to remain together and, of course, pose no risk to themselves or the surrounding population. So that's the concept. Again, everything has to be reviewed. That there's a strict sort of testing and screening and isolation and quarantine requirements, and so routine testing is part of the sort of mitigation plan. But all of that has to be evaluated in real time as well. And the local health authorities have to be comfortable with being engaged on what will happen if, say, there is a player that is tested positive. So that requires the local public health support for those protocols.
Thank you, Dr. Tam. Operator, next question, please.
Thank you. Merci. Our next question, notre prochaine question is from Michel Lamarche avec TVA. Please go ahead. À vous la parole.
Question from TVA. Hello, this question is for Mr. Duclos. Mr. Duclos, I would like to hear you talk about the most recent figures from the Parliamentary Budget Officer, who assessed the cost of extending the CERB. He spoke of approximately $18 billion more in expenses. Did this surprise you? I'd also like to know if you're disappointed to see that the wage subsidy is not getting much pickup. It's not as important as popular as you had hoped, rather. Answer. The first thing that I'll say is that we're always very happy with the work of the Parliamentary Budget Officer, who has not only the ability but the obligation to provide the government and Canadians with the information they can provide. As the Parliamentary Budget Officer himself said, this information may be erroneous. We'll have to wait and see what happens in the coming weeks. We receive this information then, and as we know, this information will be used by the Minister of Finance, who himself, on July 8th, will table an economic snapshot of the Canadian government's fiscal situation. Now, in other words, the costs are estimated, but they are not very accurate. This estimate is not very accurate and could be subject to error. In the coming days, we'll have separate estimates published by the Government of Canada on CERB, and we'll be able to compare our own figures with those of the Parliamentary Budget Officer. As for the wage subsidy, we're seeing that it's slowly becoming more popular. It's a new program, not just for the government, but for businesses. The impact of this subsidy is growing. The Minister of Finance has announced an extension until August 29th and has also announced that this wage subsidy will become more and more important. Follow-up question. I'd like to hear you on the Canadian Mortgage and Housing Corporation statistics, which were published earlier today. Among others, there has been a considerable setback in construction projects in Montreal for the year 2020. There may be a rebound after. But do you have major concerns when you look at these figures? Do you have major concerns about the real estate market? Do these forecasts and data worry you? Answer: I'm actually quite confident. I am particularly confident in the work of the Canadian Mortgage and Housing Corporation. The two key words here are confinement and then confidence. Confinement in Quebec and in Montreal in particular hurt the economy. It was necessary for health reasons, and it included the confinement of the construction industry in the beginning. Understandably, the construction industry has had some delays. I am, however, very confident about the situation in Quebec and in Montreal in particular. Montreal had a very, very good economic situation. We have almost full employment across Quebec, and the strength of the Quebec economy is excellent. And in Quebec in particular, we have strengths, innovation, for example, investing in new technology, investing in infrastructure, particularly in the region of Quebec City. I'm very confident then that as the CMHC suggests, the market will rebound very quickly.
Starting with David from CBC.
Hi, everyone. We've seen a considerable rise in coronavirus cases in the United States. And as you said, Dr. Tam, a lot of the infections we're seeing are in the Americas. So is the government considering any more testing, tracing, or any additional measures for people who are allowed to cross the border? You know, I'm thinking about truckers, people en route to Alaska, that kind of thing.
So right now, the key, there's a series of measures, of course, that are applied to persons traveling to Canada. And you've heard some of these from Transport Canada in terms of for flights, for example, screening ahead of the flight, temperature check, arrival, screening questions, and the mandatory 14-day quarantine with sort of certain exemptions. And people who are truck drivers are providing essential services, so they're not asked to be mandated for 14 days of isolation or quarantine, but they are asked to stick to the intent of the quarantine measures, which is don't come in contact with, physical distancing, mask wearing if you're not able to keep that distance, etc. So at the moment, testing is not part of the border measures, given some of the characteristics of the tests. Immunity, for example, is not yet well characterized, for example. So relying on antibody testing at this time is not being entertained until we've got more information about human immunology and the performance of the serologic testing. That's the antibody testing. Testing for the virus itself through PCR testing, that's a different test, can only ascertain whether someone is infected at that moment in time, and even during the course of illness, they may test negative, even if they're infected for the initial period of the incubation period. So there are limitations, of course, to lab testing. But we're continuing to evaluate the performance and look at all different possibilities of adding more and more layers of measures if we are to increase traffic across Canada. So I think we're continuously
We are listening
evaluating.
live here on CBC News Network to federal MPs and health officials giving us an update on Canada's response to the COVID-19 pandemic. CBC's Janice McGregor was listening along. She is in our nation's capital. Janice, questions there about the two Michaels. There were questions about how Canada is dealing with reopenings, etc. What really stood out for you?
On the China situation, I'm not sure Jean-Yves Duclos said anything that we didn't hear from the Prime Minister yesterday, just reiterating Canada's, view that the position the Chinese are taking is unfortunate, not fair, and that they don't agree with how they're being treated. The two gentlemen, Canada, of course, believes that they are being arbitrarily detained. Looking at some of the other things in the briefing, this was primarily an update on the procurement efforts. Of course, every week we often hear from Ministers Baines and Anand about that. A little bit of news there, in addition to kind of updates of how many masks, how much hand sanitizer, and so forth, that Canada's about to start taking delivery of its first made-in-Canada ventilators. I know that was something we talked a lot about earlier in the pandemic, that those efforts to kind of get Canadian manufacturing, making them for ourselves, finally starting to bear fruit. You also heard her talking about procurement processes. So in the panic of the early days, they sort of started doing a lot of sole source contracts to kind of speed up the government's ability to purchase a lot of things. You heard Minister Anand there talking about how they're going to return to more competitive processes. Those take longer, they take in various competing bids, they evaluate them. So that's not to say that they might not still need some sole source contracting going forward. You heard her talking about wanting a diversity of suppliers for all this equipment and supplies. But all the same, maybe a sense that things are kind of calming down and returning to normal a bit, which I guess is positive for those who were very afraid that we wouldn't have the supplies to deal with not just kind of the spring, but of course the need to stock up for a potential second wave. The other interesting thing, I think, for a lot of people thinking about the days of summer are the boys of summer. You heard some answers there about
the Blue Jays, right?
Blue Jays baseball and how that will work, right, with this need to keep people in quarantine when they come from the U.S. You heard Theresa Tam, the Chief Public Health Officer there, suggesting that the league needs to come up with some mitigation strategies, make some proposals. They're open to talking about ways to kind of quarantine baseball teams as a group and stuff. I don't think I heard an exact yes there that this is possible, but if you've been following the talks in Major League Baseball, I know we have some baseball fans in my house. I'm not sure the league is ready to go yet either, just in terms of its own plans and what the players are saying and everything. So maybe cart a bit before a horse there, worrying about home games in Toronto and how that would work. But nevertheless, we're all desperate for some happy diversions, aren't we, Suhana? So
Absolutely.
There's the message from the Chief Public Health Officer. She's willing to negotiate and hear their mitigation plans and evaluate them for safety, I think is how I would sum up what she said.
Yeah, I don't think the game is actually going to change. I mean, you can still probably, slide into second and more than one person can touch the baseball.
Well, it's the tagging, though. Isn't the tagging the problem?
That's right.
And it's not 6 feet between the catcher and the batter either, right?
We'll continue this conversation
later. We're going through
later.
this with my kids' baseball right now, believe me.
Thank you, Janice.
All right, fair enough.
CBC's Janice McGregor in Ottawa.